I'm working on a book, and I thought maybe I should talk a little bit about this book. And in the book, it's focused on people who are innovators, and these people that are, well, not so much innovators, but entrepreneurs that are involved in the cable industry in the United States. So I'll say a little bit about it, and eventually when it comes out, you should order it for the bookstore or something, or for the library. But I got interested in the cable industry a number of years ago, primarily because as we became the Brian Lamb School of Communication, the cable industry and the satellite programming industry and this kind of thing in the United States were big supporters and created C-SPAN. You probably know that C-SPAN was founded by these people. It's not a government entity. A lot of people think it is a government entity. Do you know what C-SPAN is, most of you? And it covers the Congress, and now it's expanded to 3 television channels and two radio networks, and it has the largest digital video, publicly accessible digital video archive in the world. And so it's quite an interesting resource for people, and a lot of people don't get a chance to see it. But as a result of these sorts of things, I started meeting people who were involved in the cable industry. And you meet the usual big people, the Comcast people, the Insight people, the Turner cable people, and all this other stuff. But you may or may not know, in the United States, the cable industry was started by a family in Pennsylvania. Does anyone know the history of this? Small family in rural Pennsylvania, and they owned an appliance store. And they couldn't sell any televisions because they were down in the valley, and the mountains around them blocked out the signals from the broadcast stations. And so they said, well, we've got to sell some TVs or we're going to go under. And so they worked out a deal where they could went across the mountains and talk to somebody over across the mountains, and they were able to set up an antenna on the top of the mountain in the valley. And that wasn't quite good enough. They didn't rebroadcast it directly. They found it was better if they ran cable. So literally, this company in this 3rd generation family still are running this cable company still. So there's something like 500 independent operators still left in the United States. Very small towns, rural areas, places. So I've been having a really good time talking with them about how their families got engaged in this, the kind of challenges they had, and recording their stories. And I never thought I would be involved in anything like this, but it's been a very fun experience. But it wasn't quite to the point where I could sort of, here's what I found to you. It's still pretty much a lot of recordings and a lot of things that I'm pulling together. And I probably could have told a lot of stories, but I don't think that's really what you want to hear. So I thought we could have a conversation about the trends in the discipline and maybe some of the ideas that are floating around, and especially how globalization and technology has been affecting what we do and how it's likely to do. So I would very much like this to be a conversation. That's why I noted it as a few idiosyncratic thoughts and concerns. So if I miss things, that's okay. You can fill in, and we can fill it in together. And I have way too many words on this, so I apologize. But I would say that fundamentally as programs, I think one of the things that's I believe over the last 10 or 20 years is that research is still central to what we do at Research One universities, whatever you want to call them, around the world. But more and more, I don't know about you, but I think in the United States we're seeing more of an emphasis or a push toward immersive experiences for our students. And the good news is, this is on the campus, the good news is we've been doing this for a while. We've had internships, we've been pushing these kinds of things, we've been pushing study abroad. But the rest of the campus, I think, is catching up with us. But a lot of these efforts are really different, I think, than they used to be. They involve teams and interdisciplinary groups working on real-world problems with community projects, and you're doing a lot of that here, I know already. A larger percentage of, I think, of our research that we do is applied, what I would have called applied years ago. It's certainly theoretically driven, but I think it's applied. And it used to be that you didn't want to do applied research. When I was, literally, we were talking about lab research, we were talking about a lot of other stuff when I was going through the academy early as a student. Really a big push on theoretically driven, don't get out to the field, it's too mushy and meshy, and watch what you're doing, because application was kind of had a dirty name. It was almost how you get your hands dirty. That's not a good thing. We were not anthropologists, where in fact you moved out and did this kind of thing. I think also a larger percentage clearly of our research is influenced by things in technology and globalization. I mean, the ideas, innovation is all about connecting things and people. And we see this. It moves at the speed of light. The ideas and the thoughts, and we do things and we get excited about trends and we adopt them. And sometimes I think we adopt them too fast. And that's going to be a little part of my message. So I think really what many would call theoretically driven engaged research is something that we really do string a lot of words together. And that's what really excites me at the moment. And I do think, at least our institution, I think in the U.S. and most institutions that are funded by the state or by the government in some way, shape, or form, has a special commitment to our constituents and to our stakeholders, and to improving the quality of life of our constituents and stakeholders. That's what we're all about. So really a lot of this is coming together for me, at least in the way I see things. So in my view, it's a great time for excitement. We can take on some big challenges, and I think we can work very closely with our colleagues on campus from the sciences and engineering, who also see things now in big challenges. If you look at what typically they're funding or what they're looking at, we're talking about big things. We're talking about climate change. We're talking about environmental sort of issues. Lots of things that I think we can contribute to in great ways. So it's a time to work across disciplines, and I think it's the best time, to tell you the truth, ever to work across disciplines. It's also a time when we have technologies and new ways to interact and to connect that I think are really useful for us in terms of our research, our teaching, and our engagement. And we all know what these are, but certainly the social networking techniques or tools that we have, but there are lots of other things as well. And it's really these tools that I want to talk about, because I do think that some people think and believe, and we need to be concerned about the extent to which these may disrupt this model that we've been used to, and at least I've been used to in higher education for a number of years. So, in fact, some people contend that basically higher ed is currently in the crosshairs of the next major disruption in basically that we're looking at society. We know the music industry really began to view ownership quite differently, at least people involved in this in the music industry. Certainly it's a looser concept, I guess that's one way to think of it for suppliers. We were talking this morning we were talking about an aspect of this with one of our guests who came in from a company called Redbox in the United States, and we were talking about how they deliver DVDs, and we were talking about piracy and how we get movies here, and the difference to going to film and content. And it was I think it was a pretty interesting discussion. But I remember when my son first discovered Napster, and led me down that terrible path. So I must admit that I do have some MP3 files that probably I didn't pay for. But so the traditional transaction in music certainly has changed, and some of the old-fashioned music companies are really, well, they're really very much challenged compared to what they were before. And the likes of Spotify, are really prospering. So I have this up here because, of course, last week Blockbuster went down in the United States, which was a bit of a disrupt. Well, it wasn't so disruptive, I suppose, but it was a little bit disruptive to the content providers. They didn't much like Blockbuster, the whole model of being able just to buy a few videos or DVDs and then rent them out. They wanted money for every single time. But it's gone. Borders, as we know, we had a Borders, and I typically run and take pictures. I have these great pictures, I believe, of where payphones have been ripped out in airports, department stores that have gone out, especially in the media area. So Borders was disruptive, Blockbuster was disruptive, but certainly they're now finding themselves on the other end. And of course, these are European companies, and we have Kodak, major companies that really did amazing things and are no longer around. I think in terms of media, the purchase of journalism products of some kind certainly has become something that consumers are less willing to do. And part of our conversation about long form and short form, basically journalism, focused on this the other day. When you have companies like BuzzFeed, which basically regard sort of journalism as a supply chain rather than a craft, that put out lots of different stuff, and they rely on churn, they rely on the advertising, and you keep coming back and reading the short thing, then it becomes a very different situation. And then we also are faced at the same time with this notion in higher ed, I think, at least in the U.S., that somehow this teacher-student is becoming a provider-consumer sort of model. And I really think this idea has traction among certain groups, but I think it's completely wrong. And we can talk about that later. Maybe that's something we can chat about. But so I think that education is not the music business, and it's much more than just reading news. And our delivery system, if you want to put it in business terms, our supply chain is much more complex than those in that industry. And so I think that for those of you who say, "Oh, we're done for," I'm not in that camp. There's a lot of stuff going on that we can talk about, because certainly it's out there, and certainly people are going to be affected by it and influenced by it, and we already are. We use it in various ways. But I don't think it's going to have the same impact as some people believe it did. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, and try to put it in slightly different terms, and then sort of say, what should we be concerned about, though? What should we focus on? And maybe this is a very traditional notion, but you'll find that I think you'll see that I'm coming through as, I hope it's not an old fuddy-duddy, but I hope it's someone who has a sense of what's going on, but still thinks that there's inherently value in what we do that's beyond the current, that won't be disrupted beyond what we're doing. So if you think about this, and I want to thank one of our friends, and you know Rusty well, Rusty Roof, who I think probably I thought about this and got influenced by some of the things he said a few years ago. But I want to think about this maybe in terms of applications and platforms, and how we think about what a platform is and what an application is. So I think everybody knows this, but an application is what a software program that sits on top of a system software, because it's really unable to run without the operating system and the system utilities. It's kind of out there. It's an app. And we are fascinated with apps. At the same time, a platform is the underlying hardware structure, right? The architecture that allows the software, and particularly these applications, to run, really perform. So as I was thinking about what Rusty said and other people have said, I began to think a little bit about applications as being similar to courses and other sorts of things that we do, or other sort of software programs. Last week, I think it was, or maybe it's 10 days ago or so, or maybe 2 weeks ago, there are now 1 million apps on the Apple iTunes store, which I don't know what you do with 1 million apps, but it passed 1 million apps. Last time I looked, it was about 750,000, so I was really surprised to see it was up to that. You may even have colleagues, or we have a colleague at Purdue, or students who have developed apps for iPhones for all sorts of things, maybe the iTunes store. And these apps cover almost every possible thing, and some are very popular, like the various Angry Birds stuff, and some are not so popular, very few downloads, but you would expect that with 1 million apps out there. And sometimes I think our schools, our universities, our programs really are pretty much a little bit like the apps, the iTunes store, that we have so many of these that we're always putting something out, that there's always the latest kind of thing. And it's a little bit, I certainly can't keep up with the changes that seem to just come through our program as far as curriculum. It's always a surprise to me. Then you always have these skills that one necessarily might have. Social media skills, or flipped classes, or whatever, or somebody must have application, or must have process of some kind. And things that we didn't really talk about 10 years ago, I think. And what do we do with them? And that's always, and then they're often littered. We have a big, I don't know about you, but we have a big closet that things go into. And I keep thinking we should go in there for eBay and try to sell some of this stuff, because it's stuff that that never caught on, that never really did work, but it keeps piling up. And so I think sometimes there are courses that do the same thing, or some ideas to do the same thing. Maybe I can tell you, I have a Newton. Has everybody ever heard of a Newton? Okay, you never heard of one. Apple put out a Newton pad years ago that it looks like a little small tablet computer, and when it didn't do very well, to tell you the truth, And when Steve Jobs came back to Apple, he did away with it because he said, well, pretty much computers should have keyboards, which I thought was interesting, given that now, of course, we've gone to the iPads, so you changed that a little bit. But that's again in one of my file drawers with a lot of other things. But I guess what I want to say here is that my philosophy is pretty simple, and maybe shared by a number of you, that we should really think about this every time we have a new potential trendy course or a trendy thing that we want to do. and realize that there are ways in which we can integrate this into our coursework, but maybe not develop entirely new apps or entirely new curriculums based around some things that are going to be changing in a very short time. I think what matters for the most part, and this is maybe stretching this a little bit, is to the strength of the platform that we have. And so I think platforms is foundational. And in this case, I'm talking about our curriculum, and really built on things like excellence in scholarship, critical thinking, engaged immersive experiences. These are foundational platform things to me. Identification and cultivation of the best talent. As institutions, things we are supported by our government, so we need to deliver on our fundamental responsibility, I think, to, as I mentioned before, to improve the quality of life of our citizens. And certainly as enticing as these apps are, as trendy as they happen to be, I think, again, we need to pay close attention to the platform itself and to the basics. So I guess I'm trying not to preach what might be referred to as a stick in the mud approach or a resist. That's not what I'm talking about. What I advocate, I suppose, more of anything is investigate and embrace. Take a look, integrate it in where it makes sense. Don't just grab and run with the latest trend. And so what are the fundamentals? What constitutes our platforms? So I would argue that it's really the same skill set that we've been talking about for decades. Our students certainly need to know the language, and I'm not talking about Mandarin English here. I think they need to know the latest tools, they really do. But that's a short-term fix. That might get them in the door. But what's fundamental in terms of our platform are things like good writing, presentation skills, exposure to the liberal arts, the ability to perform well under pressure, the ability to complete tasks, and the ability to apply critical thinking skills really to their jobs and to their lives. Because when you talk to alumni, and some of the people we've been talking to over the last few days, they may be involved in the latest greatest stuff, but it falls back to good writing. It talks about to critical reasoning, to the ability to make an argument, the ability to collaborate, this kind of thing is really fundamentally important. So I think that's, again, what our platforms are all about. I don't know that our students need to be familiar with the latest apps, or, I think they do need to be, familiar with the latest apps and the latest technology and their strengths and weaknesses, but it's really these fundamentals that are going to pay off to them, for them in the long run. It's really, I struggle with this on occasion because students, as individuals, we come into every situation with our own set of skills, our own set of abilities. And there's always this, how much can we add in terms of value to the situation? And I think there's quite a lot. I was struck by the grad students are great, but I was struck by the undergraduates that have been with me for the last few days, especially these two women who want to be social entrepreneurs. And they talked about I said, so what do you want to do? We want to change the world. That's quite impactful when you have a conversation with two, what would you say, 19, 20-year-olds. I think it's quite interesting. Certainly they bring their own, but we can add value to that, and we can certainly add value through our platform. So again, I think that we shouldn't think about this. We shouldn't be surprised to think of our universities and our communication programs as platforms. Certainly, as I look at this particular institution and what you've accomplished over the last 20 years, really, and you've gone through. How long have you been a department?
5 years?
No.
Not even that.
No, we were a program, right?
Yeah.
When we started as a department only 2 years ago.
2000.
And how long were you a program?
More than 10 years.
10 years?
Right. Has been under communication union year for at least 5 or 6 years. Right? And before that, it was another 5.
Information.
So 10 years
something.
about.
Yeah,
So about 10 years. So are you celebrating anniversary?
We should, huh?
That's the man with the money.
That's right. Yeah, so really, if you think about it, it's amazing what's happened in the last decade, right? In terms of the changes that you've been involved in. But, and you know better than I what of course this looks like and what this has been involved in. I was thinking about what's happened over the last 10 years. 10 years ago, I remember everyone was talking about convergence. That was one of these things that you heard down the hallway. You don't hear that very much anymore, right? There's not much in the way of conversation about convergence. And last 10 years, journalism and PR and advertising have fundamentally changed. They really have in the way we think about it, the way they act, what they do. We've entered what some would call an era of personality journalism. In terms of, we now use the term strategic communication more than PR, or at least equally. And of course, we hear a lot about personal branding, which is something that we didn't hear about before. In the last 10 years, we've seen a really huge reduction in the U.S. of people working in traditional media, and that's had a big change on what our students do and the way that we think about what our students should know. You could look at the traditional journalism schools, and IU started about 8 or 9 years ago giving a disclaimer kind of thing where you'll not necessarily get a job in journalism if you graduate from here. And that was quite some time. Actually, that was kind of forward-looking in some ways. But huge changes in traditional media and the way that we source and the way we verify information. And that we don't do it the same way. It's a struggle, especially as things have speeded up in terms of getting that story out, what's going on. I keep watching the developments in the Philippines, thinking about that, but then lots of other things that we see. We've seen a big influence, and maybe some of you have been involved in this, of people who are in traditional journalism and moved over into PR. PR, or strategic comm, especially in the United States, weathered the recession reasonably well in terms of number of jobs, whereas the traditional journalists continued to go down. So it's been a real interesting situation. And a number of very experienced people have moved over to PR companies, something that they said, I'm sure early in their career, they would never do, because PR was evil. You know, very often it is. I'm just sort of thinking about that with traditional journalism. I remember 5 years ago in the hallway talking to some of my journalism colleagues at Purdue about backpack journalism. You don't hear that anymore. iReporters thing, I think that's getting a little tired too, although you still see that. Wired magazine has this wired, tired kind of continuum. Have you ever seen this? Where they take various terms and they talk about if it's really hot, really good, going along, it's wired. On the other hand, it can be tired. And we move through these terms like we move through apps. They move the same way. They get rather tired quickly. You think about the last 10 years, majority of journalism students, again, have ended up pretty much knowing, hopefully, that they're not going to get a job in traditional industry. And this is worldwide. I was very surprised, maybe I shouldn't have been surprised, but someone can tell me, how many journalism schools are there in China? A lot.
Really a lot.
Yes.
Now it's like some of the small cities like already establishing the journalism school because it's very profitable for them.
I was told when I was there in, I think, December, maybe, that there were over 700 journalism schools in China. Yes. And they've all moved from departments and things like this to schools. 700. You know, that's just staggering to me. Anyway, the last 10 years in the U.S., among the trends, we've stabilized the number of communication majors. If you look, it wasn't look like this. It was going up, and now it's stabilized, which I think is a good thing. But in the last 10 years in the U.S., we've actually doubled the number of new PhDs coming up. So there's been an increase in PhD programs. There's been an increase in the number of PhDs. And of course, the job market in the last 5, 6, 7 years has been like this. So this didn't used to be an issue, but it clearly is an issue. So these are just, again, a few of the changes that we've seen. We've also seen a huge growth and I think legitimization of online programs. I think it's more of maybe, it depends on where you are, but we certainly have seen that. In part because some of the major institutions, universities, have gotten involved in them in ways that they hadn't been involved in before. So that's lent a certain legitimacy to them. And in part, and I hate to say it, but in part that's because there's money to be made. And we've also had a huge growth in the number of private institutions, for-profit, let's call it that, for-profit institutions that are offering online programs, sometimes very questionable. But there are some good things, and we've integrated some of these things into our classrooms in ways that we didn't think about before. the flipped classroom kind of notion is pretty common. A lot of our students do things online as part of their classes. And so it's one of these things where I think it was trendy before, but it's starting to be, it's integrated in some ways in what we do. The last 10 years we've seen, and this is one that always interests me, and I was reminded of it yesterday a bit. Last 10 years we've seen media conglomerates and textbook companies like Wiley, Pearson, and so on. They really transform into technology-focused private educational concerns. They're changing fundamentally. It used to be you just bought textbooks from Wiley, or you just bought textbooks from Pearson, but that's not the case before. If you look at who owns the private or for-profit online degree programs, many of them are tied into these textbook companies. You may or may not. Brian Lamb, who's the founder of C-SPAN, always talks about find out who basically is behind it, the organization of the company, who owns it. And in this case, it's very interesting. Yesterday, I got an email from Pearson, or not Pearson, from Taylor and Francis from NCA, inviting me to a panel discussion. And I thought, why am I getting an email from a textbook publisher inviting me to a panel discussion at NCA with the faculty members listed? So it was, I don't know, it was a very interesting email, and maybe I'm reading too much into it. But again, it's our associations, a lot of our academic associations, I think, are very close to these same people that we see below. So I'm sure that we'll see a little bit on the CRITNet soon about it. Last 10 years, I think technology certainly allowed us, in fact, required that companies become media companies, or organizations become media companies. Bloomberg, which was a data company, is a huge media company now. Google is a media company. It didn't used to be. We didn't think of Google originally as a media company. Facebook's a media company. NUS is a media company. You are a media company. You're putting out your information. NUS has a very active web page, I'm sure, and Facebook and Twitter and everything else. Yeah, you're there. You're a media company. In the next 10 years, I think maybe next 5 years, really we're transitioning, and we'll be thinking of all these as data companies because they are data companies. We are collecting so much data on everything. It is the era of big data in about every way possible. And so Google, Bloomberg, Pearson, Microsoft, Comcast, New York Times, all these companies are data companies. And they're all competing, which you never would have thought they would compete, but they're all sort of moving toward the same sweet spot, in my view. So I think it's safe to say in the next 10 years that we'll also see even greater impact from technology and globalization. And we can talk some more about this because it's a bit scary when you combine it all with the surveillance stuff and everything else that's going on, to think about all the data that's available and shared out there. And it would have been fun to have had that conversation too. I don't think it's a surprise to anybody that in the next 10 years we're going to see even more change in our field. In the last few days, we've seen Twitter go public in the U.S. The last couple of weeks, which I haven't looked at the stock, and I don't have any stock in Twitter, or I can publicly say that. We've seen the end of Blockbuster video in the United States, and we continue to have this incessant, almost, revelations regarding privacy and what sort of our information is out there and how much is being shared by whom. So there are a lot of, I started off with a picture of Blockbuster, I think it's a tale of woe perhaps, but maybe for a while it's a tale of success. But I'm an optimist, I think, and I have confidence certainly that most of us will be successful because we've been focused, and the U.S. has certainly been focused, and we're trying to focus at Purdue on a lot of these basic things that I think will survive over the decades and won't be just a trend in some way, shape, or form. So I just wanted to use this as a way to start a conversation. You may or may not agree with me on some of these things, or you might want to pile on. But I'm very interested in what you have to say about things that you've seen that you think are having an impact on what we're doing, and trends, because those are a few of my notions and ideas, and not just mine, obviously. Just like anyone else, you always talk with people and you build on what they talk to you about. But I appreciate being here, and that was just a way to start the conversation. You ready to get your gifts back?
Well, I really enjoyed the presentation. Well, I actually graduated from one of those 700 journalism schools in China.
Right.
Yeah, so when I graduated, I did want to become a journalist, right? That was a very promising, popular, as you say, a profession at that time. But it's no longer the case. No longer the case. And even as a teacher now, I cannot imagine my students becoming a journalist in Singapore. Really, I just don't think that will be a good option, good life choice for them. Right. Well, that's because the market, the media market here is very small. There are so few media players anyway, right? But even just imagine in China, I can't really recommend to any young undergrads and say, you should go for journalism. So then I keep asking myself, which industry should I sell my students to? Right? So I constantly face this question. Right? If not journalism, then does it have to be advertising and PR? And even advertising and PR are now reshaped by the new technologies. They're quite different from before. So I don't know. It's such a puzzle to me. I don't know. What do you think?
Well,
Right.
I was going to add to that.
Right.
I think a kind of a little different picture emerges in India, which more and more media companies are coming out. In fact, there's a growth of regional newspapers, regional news channels. And there are not enough communication schools training people how to hold a camera, how to write. So I think it's kind of
Quite different. Yeah.
Well, India, I think, is the exception. We do know that if you look at the media, media, at least in the U.S., you actually have a lot of more outlets in some ways than you've ever had before. But you have fewer of the big Time magazines, Looks, the sort of USA, the bigger kind of entities. And instead, you've got a lot of very specially focused publications and print publications and things like that. And people are certainly reading and things like that. But the environment looks a lot different. Yes?
Yeah, what I'm worried about also is in journalism schools, the practice is different. You talk about what value added does a university have, and I'm finding that in journalism programs, we're teaching students how to sort of take the aggregated news and rewrite the news, and to sort of, which is basically PR. I mean, it's not, we don't have the sense of, go out, do some research, find it, in that way, it's really now, sometimes I'm just afraid to see some of these courses where it's like, okay, your assignment is go out and get the news that's out there, and then cobble it together, and that's journalism. And it's, so when that goes back to always we're at the tail chasing sort of, and it makes the idea of university, constantly we have these issues about our relevance and how cutting edge and the rest of it, which is, really basically what your presentation is about, what is the core of what we do. And so, yeah, it's really how we're teaching in university that concerns me.
And I think this is the conversation that we often have, and I'm not a journalist, and I actually never went to journalism school. My undergraduate degree was in political science. I have, however, been, had my journalism fixes. Good friends that are journalists and spend a lot of time talking with them about what they're doing and looking at the changing landscape of it. And looking at the changing landscape of journalism schools and what they expect to see. I bet the 700 journalism programs in China, again, I think most of the people I talk to in business and industry and who are saying, we're looking for, not journalism, but what kind of skills are we looking for in employees? What kind of people are we looking for? We're looking for people that, high energy. We're looking for people that can write well. We're looking for people who can work well with others in collaborative environments that involve people different from them, in diverse environments. You see that as part of it. These to me are the same skills that people are looking for 50 years ago. And something that's fundamental in a lot of ways what universities do. So I think it's, I guess my point. On the other hand, there are things that come along that our students need to know about. and that get them in the door sometimes.
It's difficult because, you know, we don't have this job title, you know, baker, butcher, candlestick maker, you know, I mean, what you're gonna be is a worker with lots of these great skills. You know, but what industry do I sell that to? And it's like, or information specialist, you know, we don't have this, you know, baker, butcher, candlestick maker that, you know, has kind of consolidated that yet in the minds of, I think, a lot of our students.
There was a recent survey poll that said that the older generation don't understand the newer job titles that their kids are having now.
Right.
So that's out there.
No, that's me for sure.
The dream architect we have.
Yeah, that's right. We had a title. That was the title, right?
Yeah,
Dream Architect.
dream architect.
Mm-hmm.
One of the speakers 2 days ago.
Yes,
Like,
yes.
actually, it's the CEO. It's like
Yes.
she titled herself as dream architect.
That's the nice thing about a startup company. You can change. You can do whatever you want.
And this Lee has the, I think it's the Imagineers. Yeah.
Engineers.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's like.
Yeah, I'm sure that's always been the case.
I mean, I didn't come from journalism school. I came from an I school, an information school, and you know, we've had this sort of self-flagellating conversations for a long time. I think any program that's sort of at the interstices, you know, that's sort of interdisciplinary is going to suffer from this because you don't have a defined core, or maybe the core should change, right? I wanted to pick on something that you mentioned earlier in the talk, Howard, about how we shouldn't be looking at things from just a provider and customer standpoint. I've been a teacher on and off for about 20 years already, and this trend is here. You know, this is the way we evaluate ourselves, right? Students as customers, we are the providers. When schools start putting themselves up for ISO validation, you know, the game is up. In Singapore, high schools and elementary schools are going for ISO validation, or have done so. I think that trend is sort of petered out already. But it also stems from the fact that as an educational institution, we perhaps haven't done a good job in sort of staking our claim in the ground, right? What defines us? How do we measure ourselves? What's the yardsticks?
I agree with you.
I mean, I think student evaluations, when you think about its inception, it was meant to provide feedback that wasn't there, but it was just one part of many items.
Right.
But today, that's the be-all and end-all. And I think the system is skewed.
And a lot of people are having this conversation about especially about student evaluations and the advent of all these other data points that are available, but the rated professor thing, all this other thing that goes on. But at least in the U.S., when you look at the model for funding higher education, this has really pushed us more toward this notion of customer service. As students are paying more and more for their tuition and the state is paying less and less, then there's a system of, am I getting my money worth?
Yes.
Because it didn't used to be, I mean, you could have said it before, but it wasn't quite as emphasized as it is now. And then when you're paying lots and lots of money, and then when people are questioning what this money is going for now, especially as the jobs aren't there compared to what they used to be, or the specific jobs aren't there, what should we do? Did have an interesting conversation with a colleague in the business school the other day, which sometimes happens. You know, what I mean is, business school people, they think a certain way. But we were talking about this, and he said, you know, I've thought of this not so much as the students as a customer, or our customer. He said, but I really think of and see what you think of this, as the students as our product. And he goes, as a result, he says, we're mutually invested in this. He goes, certainly I have obligations, but the student has obligations too, and we have to work together so that when they come out of this, there's value that's added. And there was something that appealed to me about this notion. And I really like that. I don't know if that's a model that works.
I actually, in the first day of class in my institution in the U.S., I actually have this conversation with my students, and the analogy that I use with them, I read from a Chronicle of Higher Ed once talking about, I say to you, this is not a client, this is not like, right, but I always use a more crass kind of analogy. I say, this is not Burger King, you know. You can't have your burger your way. I say, but the way that you should think about this is a different sort of relationship. I am a professional, so therefore, if you were to go to your accountant and say, I don't like these numbers, I'm the customer, please change them, right? What would your accountant say? Your accountant would say, I am responsible to my profession, the code of my profession, right? Therefore, you know, this is not Burger King. And so I basically have that, you know, yes, it is, you know, if you want to think of it that you pay me or the rest of it, you know, but it's that kind of type of client.
I mean,
relationship.
It's so evident in fields like social work, right? So I came from a school which had the #1 social work school in the nation, in the US. And you know, it attracted a lot of people, and they would paying you know $40,000 a year. It's the most expensive public school in the nation. But they would go out for jobs which paid them barely minimum wage, right? So what's going on there, right? And how does the client-provider relationship still sustain itself? Because I think as journalism schools evolve, it's going to be more of a vocation, right? So social work trains vocationalists, right? People who see a calling in their life. That's why they're willing to accept the sort of differential between what they've paid and what they're getting back in return. I think journalism is going to be a vocation.
Well, journalism has always been a vocation. You know.
We get paid peanuts for doing all that work. I mean,
And you're right, now it's more and more, it's equivalent of our adjuncts. You know, in some ways, they're just more and more part-timers or people that are just getting paid by the word, as you know, in journalism, which is really, really a tough situation. So there's it's a challenge in a lot of ways. What do some of the other folks think?
Actually, when you talk about what we need to train the students, I agree that like language, writing, presentation skill, those kind of things essential. So something like pop up the idea of the Chinese Asian education system. Actually, there's no discipline. What you learn is like the philosophy, the basic from the teacher, for how to be a human being. That's what we need to do. And then there's no discipline, there's no science, no arts. It's like we have the grading system in the past. It's like you need to pass this standard and then you will become ranked as one grade. And then after you're going to be this grade, you can go to be the government official and you'll serve the people. This kind of philosophy. And I think actually what we train in university is actually we are training students to serve the society. The discipline doesn't matter. If they can be a good person.
I'm kind of interested in the notion of training versus education.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things I do, and I've always heard a lot actually in China, is training.
No,
As
it's
opposed to
really,
education.
really old. Really old. In the past, it's like different. I think it's 3 categories or more, but it's very, very complicated. For me, as I'm also learning about that. But after coming into PhD school, I find it's interesting because I don't think the subject matters, because it's like I'm learning how to think rather than I learn how to think in this discipline.
they're not teaching you well.
No, I think it's important. If you are just like thinking, you are just like learning.
Your parents aren't paying for your tuition, is I think in the US.
Actually, that's the thought I had. Is all of us having been at least been trained in the U.S. or have had our education there, taught well and teaching now. I wonder, do you feel that sense of from our students that they are the customers and we should here and then that you know. Because in the U.S., I think there's a stronger sense of I'm paying for my education. I work hard for it. My parents work hard for it. So therefore, I should get maximum out of it. And I don't know if
That's a good question.
if I've ever felt that strongly that sense.
Because
here.
I taught all the large size modules, right? So in the large size modules, that attitude is pretty clear. I used to Singapore airline calls to to my exams. Right?
Wow.
Thanks for taking my flight.
Awesome. I love that. Do you have my size?
But that was only the first year, right? Right, but I think the higher level modules, their attitude is quite different in the higher level modules.
I mean, that's could be right because 4,000 graduate
Yeah.
students, maybe after a certain point in maybe 3,000,
Right.
it's about learning, right? It becomes about learning as opposed to
And taking the challenge.
I
taking the
think
challenges.
Singapore is a little different because a lot of it is state subsidized.
Right.
Although that's going to change as we move along. So you can expect that that's going to the sort of provider customer thing to evolve as well.
I was actually in Australia, I think, when they first started charging tuition, the students were protesting, but now, of course, all that's going up. And so it's an interesting challenge. And I do think you see it on occasion. You see it probably more in the U.S. I do remember a student, I think it was my last term as head there, so it would have been about a year ago, who wrote me an email and said, look, I need to take this class, and it doesn't really fit into my schedule. It's inconvenient, these other ones. So you need to put in a new section, just for basically her. Yeah. And get somebody to teach it because I pay a lot of money. And they usually say I, which they don't. It's usually their parents or they're on scholarship or something else. But that was the first for that. And of course, I do have parents that are the helicopter parents who call in, and maybe you don't have this here, but you call me from Chicago and say, are you in your office? My daughter is, blah, blah, and I'm coming down to talk to you. And, so it's this service notion that you better be there and be ready. And so it's kind of, maybe you don't have that kind of situation, but it's...
But on the other hand, talking about true disruption, you have people like Peter Thiel, who's giving up $1 million for an undergrad to drop out. And
that's right.
His scholarship. Right?
That's right.
So he's undercurrent behind his argument is that you're paying too much for learning too little.
Absolutely.
Come and join me in the University of Life.
Yeah.
Well, and that's the question about what is the relevance of the university? That's sort of the idea is, are we willing to say to some students, that?
Mm-hmm.
And there might be some students who were like that, but I think the university is critically important for 18 to 22-year-olds. I mean, it's, I don't say we need to institutionalize it, but that's what we do in essence. But it's a real significant time in their lives, and it's a real significant experience, an opportunity for them to exchange ideas and get exposed to ideas and be challenged by different sorts of things and ways, and move them away from sitting in the back and taking their coursework online at their house or something like that. I mean, maybe there's some 18-year-olds or 17-year-olds who are ready to launch and get out there, and there probably are. We know there are, but I think I have this view that it's mostly a good thing for them to be on the campus of the U.S., talking to one another and meeting with faculty.
Does anybody else get frustrated like I do when students interact with me via email or in 140 characters? And I have to explain, like I was just trying to explain social constructionism via email, a series of email, and it's like, I'd rather just have you here and have this discussing, and it's just. Does anybody else get frustrated with that?
Well, I'm surprised that they know what email is. I'm just kidding. Emails. I don't know, at least for my daughter, it was a preferred mode, and neither was the phone, actually. It was...
What, Instagram maybe or something?
Yeah, texting, shorter sorts of things. She used to complain when we treated texting like an email. You're not using this right.
Well, they've officialized that syndrome. It's called TLDR. Too long didn't read.
Too long didn't read.
I haven't heard that.
TLDR.
Is that just a specific Singapore thing?
No, it's
TLDR.
I don't know. It's a phenomenon that frustrates a lot of people. TLDR.
I got the butter.
Especially like terms or ideas that you have to unpack. It's like, I cannot explain this because it would be even more confusing and becomes a longer discussion.
But then
If
it's
you
my
just
fault.
ask me, yeah.
It's my fault that I can't explain this in 140 characters. I'm a bad teacher. You know, that's how I feel. I was like, wait, do that sentence over. Even, you know, smaller and
You need to
smaller.
be a pithy hashtag.
Exactly. I'm any more pithy.
TLDR.
Would, you know, is in U.S. also, I mean, one of the things that we clearly see, I think, is this effort to develop these immersive experiences. And it's not like typical internships, but it's to take your classes and to build in some part that will, isn't the typical classroom instruction, but projects or activities that reach out into the community or do something along these lines. You see that, and in fact, they're incentivized typically with small grants or things like that if you do it. Or you might even get release time if you build in this engagement component.
Pshaw.
Is that right?
Release time.
Have you heard? No?
Yeah, there's this summer programs Europe, like what Sharon did with his students.
But it's more like you have to initiate the
You
private
you have to initiate it, and there's funding from CDTL to get.
Nothing gets you to buy out your.
Yeah, no, you'll never buy out your time. But
Yeah.
Well, and then it's difficult to quantify when it comes to what product you have as far as promotion tenure committee and things like that, because we're still operating within a very traditional mode of rewards in a lot of ways. Refereed article counts of grant dollars you bring in, that kind of thing.
Age index.
who was it that said that you should see the students as the product rather? Did he write it out somewhere?
No, no.
He should be encouraged to write.
You
that
think
out.
somebody should write? I actually have not seen that. In,
Yeah, I have not seen
even
that.
in the Chronicle or something else, because it's an interesting notion.
Yeah.
Our product is what it said.
Underlying all these logics, I'm wondering is the idea of like money. So I was reading the other day in the New Yorker that Switzerland's going to try something new. That they're going to give people income just for being alive.
Just for
So,
existing.
Just for
Why
existing.
is it
they-
that we can do that?
yeah, I mean,
Okay,
they're trying to get
tell us more about this.
Yeah.
What
I'm alive.
existing.
I mean, it's the idea that our current like economic systems are not supporting,
Life.
are like they're failing
Yeah.
people. Yeah, people are getting they're poor, rich poor gaps. And so I think I can't remember who, but I think a minister or someone was trying to propose like something radical, like let's just give money to everyone, just for being alive, and then that kind of frees you up from the working to get by. So I'm wondering if something like this would change education. I mean, think about it. You're not thinking about, oh, I needed to work 12 hours at 7-Eleven just to pay for today's lecture, and I'm not getting the most out of it. I need to find my lecturer and get him to condense whatever he can down into 140 characters for me, because I paid for it and I worked my ass off for it. So if that pressure is not there anymore, how would that fundamentally change?
Would you have like 1 million artists and nobody working at 7-Eleven?
Or you could have people who might go back to doing the baker skills, the workshop, the carpentry, because we're so much into like knowledge economy, but
Aren't
less.
we already seeing that? People buying out and going on a farm.
Like here we're having the hawker revolution.
Hawker revolution.
Or renaissance, where like graduates or like around my age, they're just giving up jobs to go and cook food.
So something similar to the Swiss program, some Midwestern cities that are on, they're on their last legs, right? They're experiencing decreasing population, no childbirth, are trying to attract residents. And they do this by guaranteeing free education right through college for your child if you commit to staying there and paying taxes in that city for. And I think some cities like Kalamazoo has experienced a resurgence because of this program. So once you take, in the US at least, it's not the problem here where tuition for your kid is, it's hunk of change, right? Yeah.
I have a 4 and a 7-year-old, and I'm already, I've locked in the cost of their education in today's dollars. We do that in the US now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, fortunately, I put you down that trail.
Oh,
Yeah.
oh,
it's,
you've been.
No, it's have two, one who just graduated from college and one who's in college, but he has support, and they picked the most expensive schools they could find.
Eastern Michigan and Kalamazoo.
No, one graduated from Vanderbilt, the other's at Columbia. So, yeah.
I mean, if income and surviving wasn't a problem, would you even need for them to go to college in the first place if they wanted to just?
Well, you know, it didn't used to be that college was tied to this notion of, you know, of success. I mean, I did success in a different sort of way. It was to really just expand, you know, increase your knowledge. I mean, there were a lot of, it was all about quality of life.
But that had to have been before college was a media company.
Yeah. Well, yeah, no, before all our, yeah, that's right, now we all are. I agree with you. I agree.
You know, I mean, because that's the loss of our students, right? And which is dollar signs. We would never, you know, allow that.
Well, thank you very much. I enjoyed the conversation.